Hey everyone, today we're tearing down our fourth video card, I think, from the RX 5700 series. So this is the RX 5700 XT by Gigabyte, and it's a base model. It's got 3 fans. It's just the gaming, I think they call it gaming OC. And we have a separate review for this. If you want to see the thermal performance, the acoustic performance, those are the main 2 things that matter with partner models. Gaming performance doesn't change a whole ton from one to the next. So you can look at the review for the thermal numbers. But here we're just going to take it apart and see how it's constructed. We've previously taken apart this one, the Sapphire Pulse. We've taken apart the MSI Evoke OC, and then also the base reference model, of course. So we have a few options to compare Gigabyte's solution to. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly's Conductonaut liquid metal. Conductonaut is what we've used in all of our liquid metal and delid thermal tests, capable of dropping CPU thermals significantly when replacing the stock thermal interface. Lower CPU thermals don't just allow better overclocks, but also lower noise levels because the transfer efficiency is increased. The mix of gallium and indium makes for a thermal conductivity of 73 watts per meter Kelvin, outclassing traditional pastes significantly. Learn more at the link in the description below. So here's the card. This has obviously already been disassembled, so we can place some thermocouples on it. And it's a 3-fan cooler. It does use smaller fans than some of the others, like the Sapphire and the MSI cards we looked at. Both use larger fans, about 90 millimeters for those, whereas these are roughly 80 millimeter fans. So let's just double check that. Yeah, Sapphire's at 90 over there. So fan size is smaller, which has 2 results. One is that the card can be normal height. So instead of this height you get on the Sapphire card or the MSI one, where the cooler is taller than the PCB and then the actual PCIe slot, you can get a shorter card, might be useful for small form factor builds. Downside is smaller fans typically spin faster to achieve the same amount of airflow, and that's something we'll talk about in the acoustics section of our review if you check that out. Immediately, one thing we can see here is that there's a, actually I thought that was a thermal pad, but it's just a big rubber damper on the back. So there's a back plate, extends past the PCB, then there's the fin stack, fans on top of that. I can see 4 heat pipes from here. We'll look at the inside to see the rest of them. And the rest of this is all pretty standard design. It is not quite 2-slot. It's just a bit longer than 2-slot. So although you get the height that you would want for a smaller case, you don't necessarily get the slot clearance, although that'll depend from case to case how much tolerance they have. So let's take it apart. This one's pretty easy. You've done it for the thermocouples already, but if you want to pick up the toolkit we're using for this, you can get it on store.gamersnexus.net. It is specifically a GPU teardown toolkit that we made. It's got one GPU diagram on it, but we have some reference cards in here with basic instructions on how to disassemble most of the GPU or video cards on the market, and then 10 tools that we've custom built for specifically this task. This one, though, is pretty simple, and it's going to be 4 larger PH1 screws for the actual heatsink fan assembly, and then there will be 3 more also PH1 screws, non-spring tensioned, for holding the rest of the heatsink to the base plate and the PCB. Okay, so there's the screws, just 7 of them for this. Really simple, don't even need to take the PCIe plate off. In fact, all we have to do at this point is separate the card like that. We're gonna have 2 cables. There's one over here, and with the card facing down will be the bottom left. Carefully remove that. Don't rip at the cables or you might actually pull the header out. And then over on this side, you can see there's the fan cable. Okay, so we removed the thermocouples. And here's the PCB. We, I should note, have a couple PCBs videos coming up from BuildZoid. One will probably be looking at the Sapphire Nitro that a lot of people are interested in, so stay tuned for that. But this one, I guess we'll talk about this in a moment. Let's start with the cooler discussion. So the backside has just these big foam pads for vibration. The backplate kind of oddly does extend past the PCB. I guess just for looks, extends past the PCB, as you can see there. And that does block the chance for air to flow through the fins and out, but whether that actually impacts thermal performance, the answer is not really. Typically, it's not even really within measurement resolution. So not a concern there. Those will damp vibration a bit. We have a standard fin stack on this side with a separate plate that contacts the VRM, and then so that's MOSFETs, that's inductors. Your capacitor banks will end up underneath this part where there's plenty of airflow coming through from the top middle fan. And then we have the plate for the memory, which is sort of separate, but it is maybe soldered to, actually screwed into and soldered to the cold plate for the GPU. So you end up sharing a cooling solution, which is fine depending on how it's executed. Cold plate here covers the full surface area of the memory modules, unlike another one we saw recently, the Evoke. And then the heat pipe coverage, you end up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 heat pipes, and those look like they might be 6 mil or smaller, roughly. For this last one's a bit larger. It's maybe tolerance though, but so some smaller heat pipes, but you get more of them. Whether or not that does anything will depend on the rest of the cooling solution. But plate's pretty brushed up. This is normally a mark of a cheaper solution, cheaper cold plate, but again, in terms of thermal performance, it doesn't necessarily matter. It'll depend. So sometimes having a bit of a roughness to the surface can help because it gives the thermal paste some grip, but that type of extra bite for the thermal paste is only really something you want when you're working with liquid nitrogen. Otherwise, a flatter plate will offer better thermal transfer. You want obviously as little thermal paste required as possible to get the contact. So anyway, you can see the thermal paste sinking in between the heat pipes because it's not a direct contact, but we'll talk about whether that mattered in the review video separately. And then cold plates the heat pipes externally coming out of the cold plate, you have one here that just routes around under the memory. So the top memory actually gets some indirect contact to a heat pipe. And then the rest of them, 4 of them will come through here. Those are 6, maybe? Are they 6 or 8? Those are 6 mil heat pipes. And then there's another set of heat pipes over here on this side, also getting some memory coverage. So the memory is actually it is, except for this plate. Well, actually, that plate's not contacting either. So actually, the heat pipes aren't directly contacting this side of the cold plate for the memory, but I mean, I guess it would be a bit better if they did that for the memory cooling, but as you'll see in our review, it's not necessarily needed with this card. So that's the cooling solution. There's an LED cable, there's a fan cable. Your LED is going to be up there. And for the card itself, you can actually see that they have a spot where there's an option for a side mount PCIe power cables, but they ended up going with top mount. We don't need to check shunt resistors on this because it's an AMD card, not an NVIDIA card, so not really relevant here. The MOSFETs are actually, for once, easy to read without any tricks. So these are SIC 620As. And not sure if we'll have BuildZoid look at this card or not, but he is looking at some of the more interesting high-end ones. The Gigabyte card should be a bit more affordable, and we'll look into that once there's more availability of the 5700 series cards in general. But you can see it's not the original reference design, obviously. It's a shorter PCB, although they do actually end up making up for all the PCB area they cut off with the cooler to fit that third fan on there. But you do end up with 3 fans instead of 1 blower, and that's why this whole area is blank. AMD could actually make this they could probably cut it right here if they didn't do a blower design, but that's what they did. So that's the reference PCB. It's much different from what Gigabyte's running. And then the MSI PCB is very similar. The layout's actually identical to Sapphire's except for one component on it. And the difference is going to be some of the components have changed, but the layout's the same between this one and the Pulse. And as far as layout versus the Gigabyte one, it is different for these. So you can see that some of the inductors up here are in different places, different size inductors. So if you're going to use a water block for these cards, you would need a slightly different one between the two of them. So let's take the backplate off and see if there's anything interesting on that side of things. And then once that's done, we'll be done with this card other than the review that you'll need to check separately for actual thoughts on if it's any good. They've got thermal pads. That was worth taking off. It's always nice to see that. These back plates, it's not like it really does a ton. It's a couple things here. One is, depending on the PCB thickness and the PCB materials, there's an argument to be made that because GDDR6 is flip chip, and flip chip meaning that the die is actually the silicon itself is going to be closer to the backside. It's going to be at the mounting point as opposed to up here at the module level. So because they're flip chip and because there's a piece of metal, i.e. backplate, with a thermal pad attached to it, there is some benefit for cooling there. How that plays in reality, sometimes we've seen no difference by adding thermal pads to the backplate. Sometimes we've seen 1 to 2 degrees. That's kind of at the high end in a lot of them. So there's not always really a benefit, but I guess our philosophy is if you're going to use a piece of metal on the back that's already conductive, like aluminum, and it's sitting over the GPU, over the memory, you might as well add thermal pads because it's only going to help. And adding a backplate without thermal pads, you could end up having the opposite effect and kind of hotboxing it, depending on, there are some old MSI cards that did that. But anyway, that's the back of it. And the controller is going to be another 35217 International Rectifier controller. Same one we've seen on basically all of these cards so far. And then there's some additional hardware that, again, if BuildZoid is interested in this one, we may talk about separately. So that's going to be it for the Gigabyte card teardown. It's pretty simple. There wasn't really a lot to this one. It's maybe 7 screws, not counting the screws to remove the backplate. And everything can be done from those 7 screws if you need to repaste it, anything like that. Should note that you need to be careful repasting these AMD 5700 series cards because it's easy to end up with really high hotspot temperatures if you're not careful with junction temperatures. But anyway, that's the cooler. That's the PCB for the part, to the extent that we're going to talk about it today. You can check our review for additional coverage on how it actually performs, if we think it's any good, stuff like that, price, value proposition. And in terms of ease of maintenance, it is trivial to take apart. There's no trickery here. There's no glue, anything like that. So in the very least, easy to service if you ever need to. But that'll wrap this one. Thank you for watching. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up our toolkits or mod mats that we worked with today, or you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus. Thank you for watching. We'll see you all next time.